The motion before the House is that this House believes that extreme economic need should be grounds for asylum. Can I remind the speakers to please use the microphone for both of your speeches and points of information. It gives me great pleasure to recognise then the Prime Minister to open the debate for Brandeis B.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, most wonderful House, everybody here. We understand that across the world there are certainly harms that befall people in all sorts of governments, and that some of the hardships of these harms are often an economic situation that is absolutely unavoidable. The motion that we want to run is very simple, just to say that in liberal democracies, we think that extreme economic need should be grounds for asylum in the same sense that we would with other ideas like political oppression and whatnot that we would see. We want to look to two main issues in this first speech here today. The first being why we have asylum, and the second being the advantages that we actually think accepting governments would accrue from having this as a policy, as an additional condition for why they would accept people. So let's ask the question, why we have asylum. Because we think here on opening opposition that we seem willing to do things to save people who are in the absolute worst situation because we have a common bond with all human people. We think that there's something to the very nature of being a person, of having some basic level of human dignity, that we're willing to do this not necessarily just for utility, though we think there are some advantages here. No thank you, not right now. But also because, no thank you, of the idea that people are worth something, and that those people who have been put, for no particular reason, in a place that no human should have to be, gives us some level of obligation. Not total obligation, but a level enough at which we can find the most extreme cases and provide them a safe haven. We think that at the point that you're going to give any sort of asylum, that economic conditions can certainly be harsh enough that this is something that on the grounds of the worth of a human in general, we should also give consideration to. So here we want to get into the idea that just because you've been born on the wrong side of any particular border doesn't necessarily mean that people on the other side are more deserving of something than you are. No. So we recognize how we show these ideas, not right now, with what we do about how you don't have the right to political speech or to some political rights expressing yourself. And we would recognize that similarly, in an even stronger fashion, if a government were directly taking away people's access and rights, and I'll get to you in a minute, to something like food, then we would certainly find that cause. So we'll say that on an indirect level, when the economic conditions are posed, are actually restricting these even greater rights, that is a harm that we also need to look to, sure.
So will you keep the requirement that refugees should seek refuge in states that in the closest, safest country?
We don't think that all liberal democracies have to follow this particular policy. We think that in case-by-case basis, liberal democracies are capable of adjusting and creating their policies for how this should go on. But we think that what's more important in this situation is not just about geographic proximity, but about understanding the conditions from which the people are coming and the conditions to which those people could go. We don't think that your rights are changed just because you were found in a government that wasn't capable of providing you with them. And we think at the point that somebody else is capable of giving that we certainly should be. We want to give an example though, however, to the idea of how it's not about necessarily somebody else imposing a restriction of rights, simply that your rights are missing. When we look to how the disabled get their rights, we don't distinguish between whether or not you were born with some disability or whether or not you were beaten and it was given to you. Similarly here, we don't want to focus on whether or not these people have been disabled. Simply the fact that their nature of not having their rights is something that we know we can't do in all situations. But we hope that in those situations that we can, when it doesn't come at too great a cost, when we feel like we can act on this obligation, that rather than prohibiting ourselves from doing what we can, simply because we won't do it all, that we do something. No thank you, not right now. And the next point that we want to get to is this idea of the advantages for the accepting government, because we think it often actually can be in the interest of this accepting country. The first idea here is a wonderful message that these countries are sending. For all of the rhetoric that we speak about with the dignity of people, we think that it's important for liberal democracies to express to the world, to express to people who want some sort of hope that they can get something better, that there's at least a chance that something like severe economic conditions can be relieved. We think it makes you look better on a symbolic level, when not that you've given a promise to everyone, and not that you make people believe that they're guaranteed to have a choice, but that you certainly, Mr. Speaker, let the world know that you're trying. We think that inevitably, the worst case scenario is that lots and lots of people apply. But we're okay with that, because having lots of applications isn't as important as taking those few applications that you can get and relieving them of the conditions that you can be in. We think that sometimes there's also another way that this can be a separate tool for for a state to show a different message that they want. If you didn't want, perhaps, to condemn a government for something that they were doing, we think this is a tremendously useful tool. Don't go and tell Zimbabwe that it's their political issues if you think you're going to need them later on down the road. But say that you presented some natural cause, that's 7,000% inflation, which is making it impossible for these people to live in the country, no thank you, not right now, is something that you want to alleviate on that level without condemning the government. We think this too is something extremely beneficial to the idea of this state being able, and I'll take front half in just 1 second, to make this sort of message.
Sir, what kind of message do you send to the developing world when you say you give up on trying to develop them and will merely accept all of their citizens?
Absolutely not. We don't give up on trying to develop them. We recognize that development is not instantaneous, and that what we continue to hope to develop these countries, that if there are those who are capable of escaping it in the today, and here's something that actually ties into the next point I wanted to go into, potentially going back there tomorrow, we think that that can actually help them in development. Because what we'd also say is that if you don't believe the government is at fault, then you can have these people come to your country through asylum. You can give them the skills that are necessary. And if they didn't have fault with the government back at home, well then they can return with those skill sets. They can have their economic empowerment and bring it back to this country. You can, in its very essence, Mr. Speaker, in response to this POI, give the idea of continuing development. No, thank you. We think that the idea of making it so that it doesn't have to be saying a government is bad and can't work, but simply that the situation is bad and that the people deserve to get out of that situation is something that we are very proud to stand for. So what have we told you here in this debate? We think we've stood for two things. We think we've stood for the right of people, that basic intrinsic right that we think everyone should have, and that everyone should have maintained in the situations that's possible. We recognize here on opening government that any given liberal democracy can't make it possible for everyone. But we also recognize that there are those who need it, and we give it to them in some arenas. Accepting that, we think the economic arena, certainly those in the most economic extreme deprivation, are also willing to receive these basic rights of human person. We further see that because we should all agree with this on the grounds of the basic human dignity, that it would be advantageous to the government to send this message is actually a great tool, and to be able to tell other governments that we're not putting them down is something that would make it more beneficial. We find that for all of these reasons, there is great room, and we are proud to stand